Back in the late 70s, when I was still in middle school, my parents went through a rough divorce. Dad disappeared for a whole week, and Mom tried to comfort me and my brother by saying he was just away on a work trip. But when he returned, the two of them argued constantly for a couple of days before he finally left for good. He didn't vanish or anything like that. He simply moved to Crescent City and settled into a decent house near the harbor. Since he never fought for custody, it gave us the impression that being a father wasn't something he really cared about anymore. The only time he ever really brought it up was when he called me on my 26th birthday. After the split, Mom never had a kind word for him. She called him a deadbeat, said he'd lost his mind, and claimed he was off somewhere in the middle of a selfish midlife crisis. When I repeated this to Dad, he just chuckled and didn't deny it. He did say he was sorry for being so distant, explaining that his life had taken a terrible turn around the time of the divorce. He told me I wouldn't truly get it until I became a father myself, and that sometimes a man has to do what he believes is right, even if it costs him everything he's worked for. He sounded drunk when he said it, so I never gave his words much weight. What I didn't realize then was that it would be the last time I'd ever speak to him. About 7 months later, Mom woke me up in the middle of the night with a call. All she said was, "Your father's gone." Then she handed the phone to my brother so he could talk. Dad had suffered a heart attack while swimming in his backyard pool. His body wasn't discovered for a couple of days, and Mom had to go identify him. She came home in a cab that night, completely drunk, and had to retrieve her car the next morning. We held a closed casket funeral for him the following week. Afterward, my brother and I helped Mom sort out all the inheritance issues. Dad had always done well financially, so we were stunned to find out he'd left very little behind. All he had was his house, his car, a few thousand in savings, and one more surprising thing, a piece of property near Black Marble Mountain. It turned out he had built a small cabin there not long after the divorce, something none of us, not even Mom, had known about. And she had usually kept track of nearly everything he did after they split. According to the lawyer Mom hired, it was just a single-room log cabin sitting on a small plot in Siskiyou County, about 20 miles south of a tiny town called Happy Camp. We could either have it appraised and sell it along with his house, or transfer the deeds and suddenly become the unexpected owners of a cabin we hadn't even known existed until that very moment. Mom told the lawyer to put the cabin on the market, but I asked her not to rush. She argued that all Dad had left in there were jerky wrappers and empty liquor bottles, but that didn't discourage me. Later, I told her privately that I wanted to see it with my own eyes. My brother and I never really knew what Dad had been doing, and since I was the only one who cared, it fell on me to check it out. That November, I drove up after making sure the wildfires in the area were fully contained. It wasn't as simple as pulling up and loading my car with anything interesting. Getting to the cabin required hours of hiking through unfamiliar wilderness, and we were a family far more accustomed to resorts and spas than camping or hiking. Preparing for the journey had taken months of buying supplies and planning. By the time I was finally set to go, I remember feeling a gnawing sense of unease. I wanted to find out what Dad had been doing out there, whether he was just someone who secretly enjoyed the outdoors, or if there was a deeper purpose behind it. What I didn't stop to consider was that maybe I was better off not knowing. I'm not saying I expected something truly horrific. More like I feared stumbling onto proof of heavy drinking or worse, some bizarre fetish gear. That nervousness kept creeping in as the day drew closer, but it wasn't enough to stop me. After reaching Happy Camp, a kind local pointed me toward a place called Cottage Grove. There was a rafting company down there that agreed to let me leave my car overnight. From there, it was nearly a 5-mile hike out toward Black Marble Mountain, with nothing to guide me except a map the lawyer had given me. The trek was rough. I drenched my shirt in sweat, lost my way more than once, and went through so much water that I had to refill my canteen from a stream. It heated up quickly, and even with chlorine tablets, the water tasted like a swimming pool. A few more hours passed, and as the trees began to thin, I finally spotted the cabin sitting in a distant clearing. I had half expected something like a fancy hideaway, maybe a personal retreat where Dad could relax. But even from afar I could see it was anything but that. The structure was covered in moss and mold, and the front was scarred up, likely from deer using it as a rubbing post. The single front window had no glass or shutter, and the roof looked close to caving in. I tried the door, assuming it would fall apart, but it turned out to be surprisingly solid. The hinges were heavy metal, and the inside had been reinforced with panels bolted across. That caught my eye for only a moment, though, because as soon as I turned my attention to the inside of the cabin, I froze. My jaw dropped. Every surface was plastered with maps of the region, each one marked up with notes and scribbles. Scattered around were bits of camping trash too, used gas canisters, empty water cases, and similar junk. But what really stood out were the photographs pinned among the maps. Over and over, they showed the same man. Mom asked the attorney to list the cabin for sale, but I told her not to act so quickly. She insisted there was nothing inside except old jerky wrappers and empty liquor bottles, but that didn't put me off. Later, I pulled her aside and admitted I wanted to see it myself. My brother and I had little idea of what Dad had been up to, and since I was the only one curious, it became my responsibility to check it out. That November, I drove up after making sure the regional wildfires were either out or under control. Reaching the cabin wasn't a matter of just pulling up and loading my car with whatever I found. It meant hours of trekking through terrain I'd never seen before, and our family was more at home in resorts and spas than in campsites or trails. Preparing for the trip had taken months of gear shopping and careful planning. By the time I was finally ready to leave, I carried a deep uneasiness I couldn't shake. I needed to know what Dad had been doing out there, whether he was a hidden nature lover or if there was a larger reason behind it all. What I never thought about was the possibility that I might be better off staying ignorant. I wasn't expecting anything horrific, just worried I might find evidence of his drinking habits, or worse, some strange and unsettling hobby. That growing tension sat with me as my departure approached, but not enough to hold me back. When I reached Happy Camp, a helpful local pointed me toward a spot called Cottage Grove. A rafting company there allowed me to leave my car overnight. From that point, it was nearly a 5-mile hike toward Black Marble Mountain, guided only by a map provided by the lawyer. The hike was brutal. I sweated through my shirt, lost my bearings more than once, and went through most of my water, forcing me to refill my canteen from a nearby stream. The chlorine tablets made it taste like pool water, and the heat only made it worse. Hours later, as the forest began to open up, I finally spotted the cabin in a clearing. Part of me expected something impressive, maybe a private getaway Dad used to escape and relax. But from the look of it, I could tell immediately it was nothing of the sort. The place was coated in moss and rot, with the front scratched up, probably from deer using it to rub their antlers. The lone front window had no shutter or glass, and the sagging roof looked ready to give in. I pulled at the door, thinking it would crumble, but it was sturdier than expected. Heavy hinges held it in place, and the inside had been reinforced with metal sheets nailed across. That detail barely registered before my attention was stolen by the interior itself. My jaw dropped. Every wall and surface was covered in maps of the region, all marked up with countless notes and writing. Scattered among the clutter were bits of camping debris, empty water cases, burned-out gas canisters, and the like. But what really unsettled me were the photographs tacked between the maps. Again and again, they showed the same unfamiliar man. After making my way back to the cabin, I fixed myself something to eat. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat under the glow of my electric lantern, poring over the scattered maps. Certain grid squares had notes scribbled on them. Found him sleeping here, or human scat feeding. All of it made me think Dad had been tracking that red-haired man. But one note in particular stood out. Almost saw me. Too close. With too close written in huge block letters. Seeing that, along with the gun, made it clear to me that whoever this red-haired man was, he'd been a danger to my father, and possibly to me now that I was here. Some notes like "made contact today" gave me a flicker of hope, but others such as "secondary contact, bad reaction" made me question if staying overnight was a smart choice. By then, though, it was too late to leave without risking getting lost in the dark, and the uneasiness grew stronger. Once night fell completely, I bolted the cabin door, closed the tiny shutter on its lone window, and tried, unsuccessfully at first, to get comfortable on the canvas cot. For a while it was impossible, but eventually, with the steady whisper of the wind through the trees and the exhaustion from my long hike, I drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure how long I was out before a noise jolted me awake around 2:30 a.m. My heart hammered as I scanned the cabin's interior for the source, only to realize with some relief it was outside. Something was moving out there. At first, I figured it had to be an animal drawn by the scent of food. But as I kept listening, I caught a steady, deliberate, two-footed shuffle, far too sure and rhythmic to be a wild creature. The first thing I did was head to the desk where that heavy revolver sat in the drawer. I'm no expert with firearms, but I knew enough to load it and have it ready. A wild animal might wander off if left alone or scared off, but a person lurking outside in the middle of the night was another matter entirely. I crept to the little window, quickly unlatched the shutter, and aimed my flashlight through the opening. The beam spread just far enough to show what lay directly ahead, but the edges were still cloaked in darkness. The shuffling noise grew louder, closer to the light's reach. I swept the beam toward the trees off to my right. After a few tense seconds, a figure stepped into view. They were completely naked, pale skin peeking through a crust of dirt and grime. Their long, tangled red hair was wild, and I caught flashes of a beard just as matted and filthy. I knew instantly who it was. The moment the flashlight hit him, he didn't even flinch. He just kept pacing sideways, circling the cabin. He moved that way for a minute or two before halting abruptly. At first I could only stare, frozen by who or what I was seeing. When he stopped and stood motionless like some eerie statue, I realized silence wasn't an option anymore. I shouted something along the lines of, "Hey, I'm warning you, I've got a gun in here." But still he didn't react to my voice. He stood there, swaying ever so slightly like a pendulum. And then, without warning, all of a sudden, he bolted straight toward the cabin door. The speed he went from still to full sprint terrified me. I slammed the shutter down and stepped back from the wall, keeping my gun aimed directly at the entrance. My eyes caught those metal plates again, and it instantly clicked why they'd been fixed there. I thought he was about to throw himself against the door to smash it open, but as soon as his footsteps reached the porch, they stopped. He just stood outside, silent and motionless. I warned him that I had a gun and breaking in would be the last mistake he'd ever make. He didn't respond, not a single sound. There was nothing but complete silence for a full minute before a faint knocking began on the door. At first it was so soft I could barely hear it, but with every knock it grew louder and heavier. At first I thought it was a fist, but the more it went on, the more I realized the blows were much broader and exactly at head level. That lunatic wasn't hitting with his hands. He was slamming his head into the door again and again. I shouted at him to stop, staring at those metal plates and thinking, "Oh God, this isn't the first time, is it?" He kept bashing what I assumed was his skull against the thick wooden panel. I began yelling that I wasn't my father and that he had died. I didn't say it exactly that way, it was longer panicked, but I made it clear my dad was gone and I wouldn't be staying. The instant I said that, the pounding stopped. The air went still again. Then a voice outside rasped my father's name. It sounded like someone who hadn't spoken or had water in years, dry and cracked, but still clear enough for me to recognize the name. I repeated that my father had passed and that I'd leave in the morning and never come back. The only answer was that raspy voice saying my dad's name again, louder this time. I snapped then, yelling how my father was dead, how I had no idea what was going on, and that I meant no harm. I expected him to repeat my father's name once more, but the silence stretched on until footsteps began retreating, gradually fading into the distance. I stood frozen, shaking, listening until they were completely gone. The silence that followed felt like a spell breaking. I could finally move, but I couldn't stop pacing. There was no way I'd sleep in that cabin after what happened. I packed everything, made sure I was heading west, and walked through the night until the sunrise. That hike remains one of the most terrifying nights of my life. On my way out, I noticed the cabin door was smeared with what looked like spit or blood. Every shadow at the edge of my flashlight beam seemed like that pale, red-haired man. Every sound felt like him too. An owl hooted behind me and I spun around instantly, flashlight and my dad's gun raised, convinced I might have to shoot someone. I thank God it never came to that. I didn't feel completely safe until I reached my car and got it moving. By the time I got home, I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but the adrenaline still had me wired, and I didn't crash until late that afternoon. I called the Ranger HQ at Yukon to report everything I'd seen and explained. I told the Ranger only the basics, leaving out anything about the tracking or the notes my father had kept. I just said that whoever I'd seen seemed dangerous, though I didn't describe the nightmare of the night before. I didn't want to sound like some attention-seeking lunatic. When the Ranger finally spoke, what he told me stunned me. I wasn't the first person to call in a report about a red-haired wild man roaming the forest. And according to him, I probably wouldn't be the last. Apparently, the man had never actually harmed anyone, just frightened them, mostly because of his lack of clothing and bizarre behavior. The earliest recorded sighting went back about 15 years, right around the time my parents were getting divorced. I asked whether my father's name was in any of those old reports, but the Ranger said no. Before we ended the call, he suggested the man might have been some old friend of my dad's, someone out there searching for him. I said it was possible, though I couldn't be sure. My mother didn't recognize the description either, nor did she remember my father ever spending time with someone like that. That was when my curiosity peaked, and also when I realized how easily I could fall into the same trap my father had. I started thinking, why not keep the place? Maybe I could go there from time to time, piece together what Dad had been working on, solve the mystery. But I saw where that path led. I imagined myself sitting alone in that cabin, draining bottle after bottle, chasing clues until I too wasted away before my time. That image was enough. So I put the cabin and the land up for sale as a single parcel. I sold it at a steep discount because I just wanted it gone, and because the place had fallen into such disrepair. I never even considered sending an appraiser out there. The thought of someone going all the way into those woods and never coming back was something I couldn't live with. Back in 2011, a young boy and his mother disappeared on what looked like a sudden, unplanned road trip. They drifted from zoos to random hotels, as if following some hidden itinerary. Days later, the mother was discovered dead, leaving behind a chilling note. In it, she wrote that her son was safe, but that nobody would ever lay eyes on him again. Over a decade has passed, and still there's no trace of the boy, only unsettling rumors about what really unfolded in those lost days. You can hear the full story on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul. Link in the description. Music. Jump back to September of 1993. My college friends and I were about to kick off our junior year when we finally pulled the trigger on a long-discussed camping trip. We'd been talking about it for months, but schedules never lined up. So right before classes resumed, we carved out the time to escape into the wilderness for what I like to call our Call of the Wild adventure. We chose Olympic National Park. If you know it, you'll understand why. Add in the neighboring Olympic National Forest, and together you've got one of the largest untouched wilderness areas in the continental U.S., practically sitting in our backyard. On Thursday, September 2nd, we hit the road early in the morning, planning to return to Seattle on Monday, the 6th. Spirits were high, and the car ride was filled with energy, jokes, and excitement for 3 days of rugged freedom. After grabbing some lunch, we rolled into a spot called Fairhome, where a small campground and a general store sat tucked into the landscape. That would be our base for the first night before we officially set out on the trails the next morning. From there, the plan was simple. Hike to the mountain lookout, camp with sweeping views, and then wander back down through a rainforest trail we'd heard about. People said it was like walking across an alien world, raw, untouched, and alive. I couldn't wait. That first night was everything we'd hoped for. Plenty of laughs, plenty of fun. The following morning, we packed up and pushed into the rainforest, feeling confident we were on the right track. You couldn't miss the line of hills in the distance, and that's where we were heading. Getting lost turned out to be almost unavoidable. Eventually, though, we had to admit we weren't following the trail we thought we were on. Still, it didn't seem like a big deal. As long as we kept pressing westward, we figured we'd run into the lookout eventually. What we hadn't expected was how dense the forest would become. The trees closed in so tightly that, even though we knew our general direction, we had no idea of our exact location. After trudging through an endless sea of trees for what felt like hours, we suddenly stumbled across a cabin. It was so run down and weathered that it practically blended into the forest around it. The roof sagged under a thick blanket of dead leaves, vines crawled up one side, and the windows were so caked in dirt that it looked like clouds were drifting inside. The place looked abandoned at first glance. Peeking through the filthy glass confirmed it. Inside sat a mess of old camping gear. On a table lay crumpled bits of foil, a half-empty box of matches, and a dented tin can with a spoon stuck in dried beans. The floor was littered with torn granola bar wrappers and a spilled bag of trail mix. Against one wall was an unzipped, stained sleeping bag, collapsed beside a pile of damp firewood that had never made it into the fireplace. The front door wasn't even locked, so when we nudged it open, we found more of the same. Playing cards were scattered across the floor, like a game had been abandoned halfway through. The walls bore faint carvings, initials, dates, and crude sketches. We all agreed it must have been some kind of hiker's rest stop and decided it was the perfect place to pause and recharge before continuing toward the lookout. Kicking aside some of the trash with our boots and clearing a bit of space with broken branches, we set up lunch. Sitting on the porch, heating food on the camp stove, I couldn't shake my curiosity about the cabin. After we ate, I went inside to poke around, hoping to find something useful in the debris. Since the main room was nothing but garbage, I pushed into the bedroom to see what was there. One of my buddies had already peeked inside but hadn't bothered to check the nightstand, mostly because the thing was buried under layers of cobwebs. The moldy mattress in the corner reeked so badly of damp rot that I almost had to cover my mouth and nose while checking the drawers. In the very first one I opened, I found something disgusting: a used condom. I slammed it shut instantly, muttering under my breath because honestly, that was just revolting. The second drawer had a bunch of empty glass medicine bottles with faded prescription labels. But then when I opened up the third drawer, I discovered it contained some kind of leather-bound notebook. I pulled it out of the drawer, opened it up, and saw that it was someone's journal with the first entry dated in 1978. I didn't imagine it to be really that interesting, like maybe some hiker just forgot his journal or something, but after reading that first entry, I'll be honest, I was hooked. The journal had been started by someone who was right at the beginning of what they called an adventure of a lifetime and detailed their plan to basically live off the grid for the rest of their days. They talked about how incompatible they were with modern society and how they knew that they'd be much happier out there on their lonesome while living off the land. The journal was supposed to be an effort to document their adventures in the hopes that it would serve as a sort of guide to other folks who wanted to escape modernity and embrace nature. Now, as you can imagine, I was actually pretty psyched to have found something like that. I'd gone from thinking that it'd be filled with some terrible poems to being like, damn dude, I could probably get this published if I tried. I walked back into the main room and told the gang about what I'd found, but not everyone was into it. Two of them were too fixated on trying to clear the cabin's old chimney and had this total whatever reaction to me announcing my find. But my buddy Steve then says, "Really? No way." And we sat down on the porch's steps and started reading through the journal together. Now, like I said, the first entries mostly detailed what the guy wanted to do and how he wanted to do it and what he hoped to achieve. But then, as they continued, there was a lot more of the nitty-gritty survival stuff that I was actually hoping for. We found the entry from the day the guy ran out of store-bought food and had to rely on what he'd been hunting, catching, and foraging. Sounded scary but exciting too. And it was thrilling to read how happy the guy was as everything he'd worked towards was starting to pay off. But then came the part where the guy accidentally poisoned himself with some undercooked game and he got really sick for a couple of days. Now, I felt his anxiety when he Wrote about how much it had sucked to die from something as crappy as food poisoning. And we were stoked when we read the entry about how he was starting to feel better again. Now, after reading through a couple of more entries, Steve was starting to get a little bored, so he walked off to help the others to try and start a fire in the cabin's fireplace, but I kept going on, and I'll never forget what I ended up reading. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the entries got kind of SY for lack of a better word. The journal's author did pretty much the same routine over and over again with only the most minor of differences from day to day. And that meant that I went skipping ahead a lot to see if I could find any longer, more interesting entries. I watched his entries from 1979 bled into those from 1980. And as they did, they got less and less frequent. But then as 1981 slipped into 82, the style of writing started to change, and sometimes quite dramatically too. Where once elegant passages of prose degenerated into something more primitive. And it wasn't like he was talking to the reader anymore like you were a friend. It was more like he was talking to himself, or like trying to talk to God. They were long rambling tracks about how he could hear the sky sing when it got really quiet, or how sometimes when he's killing a rabbit or a pigeon, it kind of... I stared at the journal, my hands trembling so badly the pages crinkled. My friend was outside still fiddling with the stove, humming like nothing was wrong. My eyes darted to the door. For the first time I noticed that the grime and dirt on the wooden threshold wasn't random. It was a fresh smear, a boot print. And not one of ours. The window glass nearest me, the one I had wiped a circle clean on earlier to peek inside, suddenly reflected movement behind me. My stomach dropped. The sleeping bag that had slumped against the wall before was now empty, flat. I hadn't noticed that before. The smell of damp mold and old beans suddenly had another smell layered over it. Sharp, metallic, like rust or dried blood. My friend called my name from outside, but it sounded muffled, wrong, like he was farther away than he should have been. I bolted out of the bedroom, clutching the journal like it was a weapon, only to see the door I'd left ajar swinging slowly shut, as though pushed. The journal fell from my hands. Outside the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No wind. Just the soft crunch of leaves somewhere out in the trees. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. And then, faintly, almost whispering, I heard a voice. It was hoarse, cracked, but still carrying that same tone I'd read in the later journal entries. It is finished. I am finished, but you are not. We were an unarmed group of 4, having made no real effort to cover our tracks, and every snapped twig or rustle in the underbrush felt like it could be him. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. If he wanted to, he could be out there right now watching us. The fire didn't feel warm anymore. Felt like a spotlight. The flickering glow that had always made us feel safe suddenly made us feel exposed, like prey. Every time the flames popped, we jumped. Every time the wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke deeper into the trees, we imagined it acting like a signal flare, announcing our exact location. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice cracked when I did. One of my buddies finally said, "Man, what if he's reading that journal right now and knows we took it?" That shut everyone up. Because we had left it behind, just sitting there on the floor, wide open, with our fingerprints all over it. Hours dragged by. Nobody slept. And then, somewhere in the distance, we heard it. Not an animal, not the wind. Sound too deliberate. The crunch of leaves, slow and steady, stopping and starting. Like footsteps. Human footsteps. My friend whispered, "Please tell me that's a deer." But I knew it wasn't. We all did. Then came another sound. A low, wheezing chuckle. Just barely audible, carried on the breeze. Froze us where we sat. It was the exact same rhythm I'd imagined in my head while reading those last journal entries. I am finished. It is finished. I must finish it. The fire suddenly felt like a mistake, so we smothered it with dirt, plunging us into almost total darkness. The silence that followed was even worse. Because in silence, you can't tell how close something is until it's too close. That was the longest night of my life. We hadn't really tried to hide our trail. which meant there was always the chance he was creeping after us in that endless dark. The thought alone was enough to shake us to the core. We stayed tense for most of the night. Around 11 p.m. though, the conversation died down and we all sat in silence, staring into the flames. For the first time, I almost felt a little calmer. My mind started telling me that maybe I had worked myself up over nothing. If the lunatic from that cabin had wanted to follow us, he probably would have caught up by then. Maybe he only showed up every now and then, just to crash on that filthy mattress or whatever else he kept there. But that's when it came, a scream that tore through the valley. It wasn't the kind of cry you could easily label. It was something between a howl and a roar, laced with pure rage and twisted grief. Whoever made that sound wasn't in control of themselves anymore. Just hearing it froze the blood in our veins. The noise had barely faded when one of my buddies muttered, "That's him." Nobody argued. We all knew exactly who it was. No one had to convince anyone else. There was zero doubt, and we sure as hell weren't going to stay planted there. We stamped out the fire, grabbed our tents and gear in a rush, and marched through the night without stopping until the old general store finally came into view with our car still waiting out front. By then, the first pale light of morning was spilling over the eastern hills, and I don't think I've ever felt such relief. We didn't talk much on the way home. Someone mentioned we should have taken the journal as evidence, proof that someone out there had gone completely insane. But most of us agreed that stealing it would have only made him angrier, and in that case, he might have hunted us down for real. After hearing that scream echoing across the valley, I honestly don't know if he could have been any more furious than he already was, knowing strangers had invaded his place. Even now, I thank God he never found us. And I try hard not to imagine what would have happened if he had. Story 3. I grew up in a small Montana town, and back in my late teens I worked nights as a porter at a cluster of cabins up in the mountains. Basically, it was just night watch duties, making sure everything stayed quiet and running smoothly. Every now and then someone would phone the office to check in late or ask a question or two. They just put a VHS player in the office so the porters wouldn't be tempted to fall asleep. So I'd gotten into the habit of renting movies before heading to my shift and watching them straight through the night. One night, around 1 a.m., I was in the middle of terrifying myself with a Hellraiser tape, if you remember that one, when I caught the sound of something moving outside. The office had 2 big glass-paneled windows and a door with a glass insert as well, so you could look right out into the dark, though you couldn't make out much detail. City folks sometimes came up just to stargaze, so it wasn't unusual for people to wander around after midnight. The first time I heard it, I brushed it off and kept watching. But a minute later the noise came again, this time closer to the office. I turned the TV down low and sat listening. It didn't sound like regular footsteps. It sounded like something creeping along on all fours, edging nearer. We kept a loaded gun locked in the cash safe for obvious reasons, but it also doubled as protection against mountain lions. So the moment I realized something was prowling outside, I went straight to the safe and grabbed the gun. Then I eased out of the office into the lobby. Just a desk, a chair, a logbook, and those huge windows looking out into the night. As I stared out into the night, trying to pinpoint the source of that rustling, I couldn't make out a thing. I kept scanning for the shine of eyes in the dark, half expecting it because once before a coyote had turned its head and locked eyes with me, nearly scaring me into wetting myself. Even with a flashlight beam cutting across the trees and gravel, I still couldn't spot a soul. Then, out of nowhere, a man suddenly lifted himself up from the ground right outside the window, and I jumped back with a yell. His mouth and chin were streaked with what looked like blood, and his shirt was smeared with a dark, rusty-looking sludge. He pressed a stained hand against the glass for balance, smearing it, before crumpling back down out of sight. Right away I knew he was badly injured. I darted to the phone and called 911. The dispatcher asked me what condition he was in, so I hurried back toward him to get answers. She must have assumed he was drunk because she told me to ask him what he'd been drinking. I stepped outside, crouched near him, and asked the question. All he managed was a few low groans, until I finally made out 2 faint words. "Number 9. I asked him again. "Is that a drink? What do you mean?" but he just moaned in pain. Then it clicked. He wasn't naming a bottle. He was talking about cabin number 9. I rushed back to the phone, confirmed that an ambulance was on the way, then sprinted down to cabin 9 to check it out. The door stood wide open, and more of that dark vomit stained the step. Inside, it was like walking into a horror film. 3 other people were inside. 2 collapsed on the couch and floor, and another swaying unsteadily at the sink. He was retching into the basin, vomiting a mixture of blood and something else that didn't look natural. When he heard me, he turned weakly and begged, "Help me, please," before slumping down to steady himself against the counter. I kept demanding, "What did you drink? What did you take?" But all he could manage was to gesture shakily toward the table while gagging. On the table and countertops were half a dozen empty bottles. Wine, liquor, random spirits. Signs of a feast were scattered around too, like they'd had a huge meal together. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just one guy overdoing it. All 4 were sick in the exact same way, which meant something they'd eaten was rotten beyond saving. Or worse, they'd all caught something contagious that I was now far too close to. I didn't have the luxury of thinking too long on that. I just made sure not to touch them or the vomit, then sprinted back to the office to update dispatch. And when help arrived, it wasn't just one ambulance barreling up the mountain road. It was 4. Paramedics poured out, quickly working on the 4 victims, strapping each onto a stretcher. One by one, the ambulances took off down the path, lights flashing, then flipping on sirens once they hit the highway. By the time the last one left, my boss had shown up, summoned from home by my call, and he stood there beside me in disbelief as a crowd of curious guests gathered to watch the chaos unfold. He could hardly believe the disaster they had left behind in that cabin. Inside cabin number 9. He said the place reeked of blood, mixed with vomit. But it wasn't only blood. There was something more unsettling. He asked me what in the world had gone on in there. Later, when he pieced together what little truth there was to find, here's what he told me. A woman from Washington State had arranged a sort of get-together with a few of her old friends, and by chance, she chose our small row of cabins for the gathering. They all arrived cheerful, carrying bottles of wine, food, and thoughtful presents. Once they settled in, the woman who planned it secretly laced their meal with poison, cut the phone line to their cabin, then drove all the way back to Washington while her friends began vomiting and collapsing. That's as much as the police knew when my boss spoke with them. They couldn't figure out why she decided to poison her longtime friends, only that she'd used a mixture of rat killer and garden chemicals. And if I hadn't dialed 911 when I did, chances are they wouldn't have made it out alive. When I was younger, I always thought my grandfather was a rather unusual man. He was generous with money and, from what everyone said, I was his favorite granddaughter. Still, whenever he visited, he seemed distant and cold toward me. My parents explained that it was simply how he was. Having grown up during the Great Depression, he had endured a rough childhood and later poured his entire life into building the construction business he started. His sharp business sense was undeniable, but his social skills left much to be desired. He lived a long life and, when he passed, left behind a considerable inheritance. At his funeral, people spoke of him with nothing but respect and admiration. The following day, though, my dad asked me to sit with him in the living room and asked if I wanted to know the real story. The way he said it made my stomach tighten, as if he was about to uncover a deep family scandal. But then he chuckled and reassured me that wasn't it at all. Instead, he wanted to share the truth about Grandpa's early years and explain how he became the man everyone remembered. All I knew was the depression part, and it always sounded too sad for me to dig deeper. Little did I know, there were chapters of his childhood he had strictly forbidden my parents from ever mentioning to me. I couldn't figure out why, unless it was to cover up something shameful. But once my father explained, the reason became clear. Back when the economy collapsed and Grandpa was just a boy, my great-grandfather decided to move his family out of Denver, Colorado, and into the foothills of the Rockies. They cleared a patch of land, chopped down trees, and built a small log cabin to live in. Inside was barely more than a stove, a chimney, and a few beds they all had to share. Everything else was outside or completely absent. They survived by hunting, fishing, setting traps for game, and tending to a small garden. On occasion, my great-grandfather carried dried meat and furs into Denver to barter for a few basic comforts. Life was harsh, with no real celebrations like Christmas or birthdays, but since they didn't know anything else, it felt normal to them. Despite the poverty, Grandpa said he had some happy moments from those years, at least until the night the strangers arrived. He recalled that they were eating supper when they heard a group of men outside shouting for his father to come out. His father quickly told the family to climb through the back window and flee into the woods. As they ran, Grandpa could hear the agonizing screams of his father as the intruders stormed the cabin and brutally killed him. He said that he, his mom, and sisters wandered around the hills for a couple of days, barely eating or sleeping. And when they returned to the cabin, his mom made him and his sister wait out in the woods almost a whole day while she buried their father and cleaned up the cabin. After that, and at the tender age of just 9 years old, he was the man of the house. He didn't go to school. He didn't get to play around like other kids. Grandpa worked to put food on their table every day of his life. By the time he was 13, he owned a mule named Chip, and he'd ride Chip into a little town called Evergreen to work for a construction company that was based there. That way they were guaranteed some money to buy food, medicine, and all of that stuff instead of having to rely on what they could hunt and scourge for. And when he wasn't at work, Grandpa was either fixing up the cabin or butchering game while his mom cooked and his sister cleaned. He didn't have time or energy for anything else. And one of the things giving him the most trouble was the cabin's chimney. Birds liked the nest in it during the summer, and since his father wasn't an expert builder, the construction itself was far from perfect. So, while it needed a good yearly clean in early autumn to get it ready for the winter, the bricks seemed to get looser and looser with each passing. On the year of his 18th birthday, just as summer started going into fall, Grandpa got himself ready to clean that chimney. But this time no sooner has he jammed the brush up there, but a brick comes tumbling down into the fireplace, sending soot and ash all over the place. Grandpa curses his bad luck and then starts trying to put the brick back into place, but he realizes something is sort of half sitting in its place. Grandpa thinks it's a dead bird or something and gets ready to cover his mouth and nose after dragging it out of the nook, but it's not any kind of dead thing that's blocking the brick from going firmly back into place. It's 3 cloth sacks, and in them are dozens of solid gold coins. Not even his mother knew why those men had shown up and killed his father, and that was partly what made it so terrifying and traumatic for them. But after finding those coins, it all suddenly made sense. No one knows if my great-grandpa stole them or there was someone out there who knew that he was up there in the hills with his stash of gold coins. He didn't even tell my great-grandma about them. But finding them up in that chimney changed their lives completely. And within a couple of years they were living the good life in Denver after Grandpa started up a construction company all on his own. All his life, Grandpa remembered what it was like being so poor that they barely had a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So all he did was work, just like he'd always done from dawn till dusk and for the sake of his family. And the reason he always seemed distant with me, even though I was his favorite granddaughter who he spoiled with gifts on birthdays and Christmas, was because I reminded him of his younger sister, the one he had once starved with in the woods after hearing their father's dying screams. Once I understood that any resentment I had toward him disappeared. It didn't take much. I truly loved my grandpa, and I accepted that he carried a certain coldness about him. But knowing why made me forgive him completely. And wherever he is now, I hope he feels both my compassion and my forgiveness. Rest peacefully, Grandpa. Love you. Thank you for listening, friends. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll always know when new narrations are released. Fresh stories come out every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you have your own story, feel free to share it and it just might be featured in a future video. Thanks again for your support, and remember, your favorite gym teacher and your least favorite English teacher are getting married.